September 14, 1942. Stalingrad Railway Station. The sun had barely risen when Private Anatoly Chekhov pressed his back against the charred remains of a railway car, his Mosin Nagant rifle clutched so tightly his knuckles had turned white. Around him, the station, once a grand symbol of Soviet industrial progress, was now a skeleton of twisted metal and shattered stone. The air reeked of cordite, burning oil, and death. German artillery had been pounding the position for 3 hours, and now the Lancers were coming. He could hear their boots crunching over rubble, their officers shouting commands in that harsh, guttural language. Chekhov was 19 years old. He had been in Stalingrad for 6 days. 16 men from his platoon had crossed the Volga with him on a barge under German fire. Now only 4 remained. This railway station had changed hands 15 times in the past week. Today, it would change hands again. The only question was whether Chekhov would live to see it. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from the Second World War. Where are you watching from? And could you have endured what these men faced in the frozen ruins of Stalingrad? To understand the frozen hell that was Stalingrad, one must first understand how Germany arrived at the gates of this Soviet industrial city in the summer of 1942. The road began with Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's massive invasion of the Soviet Union, launched on June 22, 1941. 3 million German soldiers, supported by 3,600 tanks, 7,000 artillery pieces, and 2,500 aircraft, had crashed across the Soviet border in the largest military operation in history. The initial results were catastrophic for the Soviets. Entire armies were encircled and destroyed at Minsk, Smolensk, and Kiev. Hundreds of thousands of Red Army soldiers were killed or captured. By December 1941, German forces stood within sight of Moscow's spires. But the Soviet Union did not collapse. The vastness of Russia absorbed the German advance like quicksand. Supply lines stretched impossibly thin across endless steppes and primitive roads that turned to rivers of mud in autumn and tunnels of snow in winter. The T-34 tank, superior to German panzers in armor and mobility, began appearing in greater numbers. Soviet resistance, initially disorganized and poorly led after Stalin's purges of the officer corps, began to stiffen. And then, in December 1941, General Georgy Zhukov launched a devastating counteroffensive that drove the Wehrmacht back from Moscow for the first time. The myth of German invincibility suffered its first crack. By spring 1942, Hitler needed a victory to restore momentum and secure the resources necessary to continue the war. Germany was desperately short of oil, the lifeblood of mechanized warfare. The Romanian oil fields at Ploiești were not enough. Hitler's eyes turned south toward the Caucasus region, where Soviet oil fields at Baku and Grozny pumped millions of barrels annually. If Germany could seize these fields, the Wehrmacht would have the fuel to continue fighting. The Red Army would be crippled. The war could still be won. On April 5, 1942, Hitler issued Führer Directive No. 41, outlining Operation Blue, the summer offensive that would determine the fate of the Eastern Front. Army Group South would split into 2 prongs. Army Group A would drive toward the Caucasus oil fields, while Army Group B, spearheaded by General Friedrich Paulus's 6th Army, would secure the northern flank by capturing Stalingrad. The city stretched for 30 miles along the western bank of the Volga River, a vital transportation artery and industrial center, producing tanks, weapons, and ammunition. More importantly, it bore Stalin's name, a symbolic prize Hitler became obsessed with claiming. General Friedrich Paulus was 52 years old, tall and thin, with a perpetually worried appearance and the careful manner of a career staff officer. He had spent most of his military life planning operations rather than leading them. He was methodical, obedient, and utterly loyal to Hitler, traits that would prove both his strength and his fatal weakness. His Sixth Army was one of the most formidable fighting forces in the world, battle-hardened from campaigns across Poland, France, and the Soviet Union, numbering over 270,000 men organized into 13 infantry divisions and 3 panzer divisions. The offensive began in late June 1942, and initial progress was spectacular. German forces swept across the southern steppes under scorching summer skies, crushing Soviet resistance and advancing hundreds of kilometers. Panzer divisions, equipped with Mark III and Mark IV tanks, raced ahead of the infantry, encircling Soviet units and leaving them to be mopped up by follow-on forces. Soviet defenses appeared disorganized, retreating in haste. German soldiers sang marching songs and wrote confident letters home. Victory seemed inevitable. But the Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin prepared a defense unlike any the Germans had encountered. After the disasters of 1941, Stalin had learned brutal lessons. He issued Order No. 227 on July 28, 1942, infamous as the Not One Step Back decree. Any soldier who retreated without authorization would be shot. NKVD blocking detachments were positioned behind frontline units to execute deserters. Officers who allowed retreats faced court-martials and firing squads. Penal battalions composed of political prisoners and disgraced soldiers were formed and sent into minefields and machine gun fire to clear paths for regular troops. Their life expectancy was measured in hours. The message was brutally clear. Stalingrad would not fall. Every building, every street, every meter of ground would be defended to the last man. By late August, Paulus's Sixth Army reached the outskirts of Stalingrad. German reconnaissance reported Soviet forces digging defensive positions among the city's ruins. On August 23, 1942, the Luftwaffe launched the assault that would transform Stalingrad into hell. Over 600 aircraft, Heinkel He-111 bombers, Junkers Ju-88s, and Stuka dive bombers swept over the city in relentless waves. High explosive bombs cratered streets and collapsed buildings. Incendiary bombs ignited firestorms that consumed entire neighborhoods. Wooden structures in the old city burned like torches. The heat was so intense that asphalt melted in the streets. Smoke columns rose thousands of feet, visible from 50 miles away. Civilians fled toward the Volga in panic. Thousands crowded onto ferries and barges, desperate to escape across the river. German planes bombed the boats, turning the water red with blood. Others were crushed in stampedes or drowned when overloaded vessels capsized. Conservative estimates place civilian deaths in those first days at over 40,000, though the true number will never be known. Stalingrad, once home to 600,000 people, became a landscape of death. But the destruction created an unexpected tactical advantage for the defenders. The millions of tons of rubble, shattered brick, twisted steel girders, pulverized concrete, transformed Stalingrad into a defender's paradise. Every collapsed building became a fortress. Every crater offered cover. Streets choked with debris became impassable to tanks. The open terrain where German blitzkrieg tactics had proven so devastating was gone. Now the Wehrmacht would have to fight for every building, every room, every stairwell. And in close-quarters combat, the advantages of superior German training and equipment would be neutralized. General Vasily Chuikov, appointed commander of the Soviet 62nd Army defending Stalingrad, understood this immediately. A stocky, aggressive officer who had fought in the Russian Civil War and the Winter War against Finland, Chuikov was known for his ferocity and refusal to retreat. He established his headquarters in a dugout carved into the bank of the Volga, within earshot of German artillery. His command bunker was so close to the front lines that he could hear individual rifle shots. Staff officers urged him to move to safety across the river. Chuikov refused. "We will hold Stalingrad or die in it," he told them. "There is no land beyond the Volga." Chuikov developed revolutionary tactics for urban warfare. He ordered his troops to practice hugging, staying so close to German positions that Luftwaffe bombers and artillery could not fire without hitting their own men. Soviet soldiers occupied buildings just meters from German positions, sometimes sharing the same structure with the enemy. Soviets on one floor, Germans on another. Combat ranges shortened to grenade-throwing distance. Battles raged across hallways, through windows, up and down stairwells. Men fought with rifles, pistols, knives, shovels, and bare hands. The rules of conventional warfare dissolved in the rubble. On September 14th, the day Private Chekhov huddled in the railway station, German forces launched a massive assault to capture the city center. The 71st and 295th Infantry Divisions, supported by the 24th Panzer Division, attacked from multiple directions. Artillery pounded Soviet positions with thousands of shells. Stuka dive bombers screamed down to deliver their payloads with terrifying precision. German infantry advanced in disciplined waves, using flamethrowers to burn out Soviet positions and demolition charges to collapse buildings on their defenders. The fighting at the railway station was particularly savage. The Germans took the building in the morning. Soviet counterattacks retook it by noon. Germans stormed back in the afternoon. By nightfall, the station had changed hands 4 times, and the floors were slippery with blood. Private Chekhov survived that first day, though 2 more of his comrades did not. He would fight in the railway station sector for 3 more weeks, watching new faces arrive on the nightly ferries across the Volga and disappear within days, ground down by the relentless attrition. One of the most legendary defensive stands occurred at Pavlov's house, a 4-story apartment building near the city center overlooking a key square. In late September, Sergeant Yakov Pavlov and a platoon of soldiers fortified the structure and held it for 58 days against repeated German assaults. Pavlov's men knocked holes through interior walls to create hidden passages, positioned machine guns in every window, and laid mines around the perimeter. They stockpiled ammunition and food in the basement. German infantry attacked again and again, supported by tanks and artillery. Each assault was repulsed with heavy losses. Soviet snipers picked off German officers crossing the square. Machine gunners mowed down infantry attempting to rush the building. Anti-tank rifle crews destroyed panzers at point-blank range. The building became a symbol. Soviet propaganda claimed, with considerable exaggeration, that more Germans died trying to take Pavlov's house than died taking Paris. But the psychological impact was real. A single building, held by a handful of determined men, became a microcosm of Soviet resistance. If the Germans could not take one apartment building, how could they take the entire city? Soviet sniper warfare reached legendary status in Stalingrad's ruins. Marksmen like Vasily Zaitsev, credited with over 225 confirmed kills, stalked the rubble with bolt-action Mosin Nagant rifles. Zaitsev was a shepherd from the Ural Mountains who had hunted wolves since childhood. He understood patience, camouflage, and the art of remaining motionless for hours. He studied German patterns, learned where officers congregated, memorized the routines of enemy sentries. Then he would wait, scope-focused, breathing controlled, until the perfect moment. 1 shot, 1 kill. German soldiers grew terrified of moving in daylight. They feared every window, every pile of rubble, every shadow. Death could come from anywhere. By October, the battle had consumed the city's massive industrial complexes. The Red October steel plant, the Barikady gun factory, and the Druzhinsky tractor works, converted to produce T-34 tanks, became battlegrounds where workers fought alongside soldiers. Tanks rolled off assembly lines directly into combat, unpainted and sometimes missing gun sights or radios. Women operated anti-aircraft batteries on factory roofs, shooting down Stukas and Heinkels. The fighting was so intense that furnaces in the steel plant continued operating even as battles raged inside the buildings, their hellish glow illuminating night combat. German forces controlled 90% of the city by late October. Soviet defenders clung to a narrow strip along the Volga, in some places only a few hundred meters wide. Paulus believed one final push would finish them. But the Sixth Army was exhausted. Battalions were reduced to company strength. Regiments fought with fewer men than battalions should have. Casualties mounted daily, not just from combat, but from disease, exhaustion, and the first cases of frostbite as temperatures began dropping. Winter clothing had been promised but never arrived. Soldiers wrapped their feet in newspaper and rags. The first snows fell in early November, dusting the ruins in white that quickly turned gray with ash and blood. What Paulus did not know was that hundreds of miles to the north and south, in the darkness of the steppe, the Soviet High Command was preparing a counterstroke that would change everything. General Georgy Zhukov stood before a large map in a dimly lit command bunker outside Moscow, studying the Stalingrad sector with characteristic intensity. Short, stocky, and utterly ruthless, Zhukov had earned Stalin's trust by halting the German advance at Moscow in 1941. Now, as Deputy Supreme Commander, he had been tasked with turning the tide at Stalingrad. Working alongside General Vasilevsky, Zhukov developed a plan so audacious that even Stalin initially hesitated. Operation Uranus. The concept was elegant in its simplicity. Two massive armored spearheads would smash through the weaker Romanian armies holding the German flanks north and south of Stalingrad, then converge deep behind enemy lines, encircling the entire Sixth Army. It was classic double envelopment, the kind of maneuver the Germans themselves had executed brilliantly earlier in the war. Now Soviet forces would use German tactics against them. The preparations took months and were conducted in absolute secrecy. Over 1 million Soviet soldiers were assembled in staging areas, hidden in forests and ravines. Thousands of tanks, primarily T-34s, the workhorses of the Red Army, supplemented by heavy KV-1s, were transported by rail under cover of darkness and concealed beneath camouflage nets. Artillery pieces by the thousands were moved into position. Ammunition dumps were established. Radio silence was strictly enforced. Soviet intelligence knew the Germans suspected something was coming, but not the scale or timing.
The Achilles heel of the German position was obvious to anyone studying a map. The Sixth Army's flanks were held not by Germans, but by Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian forces. These allied armies were poorly equipped, inadequately trained, and demoralized by months of brutal combat and harsh conditions. They lacked modern anti-tank weapons. Their artillery was obsolete. The morale was brittle. German commanders repeatedly requested reinforcements for these vulnerable sectors, but every available unit was committed to the assault on Stalingrad. The flanks would have to hold with what they had. Romanian soldiers manning defensive positions north of Stalingrad could feel the storm gathering. Prisoners captured in raids spoke of massive Soviet buildups. Deserters reported endless columns of tanks. Reconnaissance patrols returned with alarming reports. But when Romanian commanders forwarded these warnings to German headquarters, they were dismissed. Soviet forces, German intelligence insisted, were too weakened by the fighting at Stalingrad to mount major offensives. It was a catastrophic miscalculation born of wishful thinking and arrogance. At 7:30 a.m. on November 19, 1942, the northern steppe erupted. Over 3,500 Soviet artillery pieces and Katyusha rocket launchers opened fire simultaneously in one of the most devastating bombardments of the entire war. The Katyushas, nicknamed Stalin's organs for their distinctive wailing sound, unleashed salvos that screamed through the freezing air before exploding in massive fireballs. Heavy howitzers fired shells that cratered the frozen earth. The barrage lasted 80 minutes, a sustained thunderstorm of steel and explosives that obliterated Romanian positions. Trenches collapsed, bunkers caved in, communication lines were severed, officers were killed before they could issue orders. Romanian soldiers who survived the bombardment emerged from their shelters to find a moonscape of craters and corpses. Then came the tanks. Hundreds of T-34s, their wide tracks churning through snow and mud, crashed through the shattered Romanian defensive line like a steel avalanche. The T-34 was a revelation in armored warfare, fast, maneuverable, with sloped armor that deflected most anti-tank rounds. Behind the tanks came waves of Soviet infantry, advancing in human masses that absorbed casualties and kept moving forward through sheer weight of numbers. Romanian units fought bravely in some sectors, desperately in others, but they were outgunned, outmaneuvered, and overwhelmed. By the end of the first day, the Romanian Third Army had ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. Soviet spearheads had advanced 50 kilometers. General Paulus received the first reports with disbelief, then growing alarm. He ordered German units to move north to contain the breakthrough, but they were too few and arrived too late. Soviet tank columns were already deep in the German rear, overrunning supply dumps, airfields, and headquarters units. Radio messages from cut-off units grew increasingly frantic before going silent. Then, the next morning, November 20th, the southern hammer fell. Soviet forces struck the Romanian Fourth Army south of Stalingrad with equal fury. Again, the Romanians collapsed. German reserves rushed to plug the gap but were swept aside or encircled. The 29th Motorized Division fought heroically but was overwhelmed. German tank commanders drove their forces forward at maximum speed, covering 30 to 40 kilometers per day, penetrating deep behind German lines. On November 22, 1942, near the town of Kalach-on-the-Don, Soviet tank crews from the northern and southern spearheads made contact. They dismounted, embraced, fired flares into the sky, and celebrated. Behind them, the trap had closed. Over 290,000 German and Axis soldiers, the entire Sixth Army plus supporting units, were surrounded in a pocket roughly 50 kilometers wide and 40 kilometers deep. It was the largest encirclement in military history. Inside the pocket, initial reactions ranged from shock to denial. Surely the situation was temporary. German forces had been encircled before and had always been relieved or broken out. This would be no different. Paulus and his staff immediately began planning a breakout operation. Every senior officer agreed the Sixth Army had to attack westward immediately, before Soviet forces consolidated their positions, before supplies ran out, before winter truly arrived. Time was critical. Paulus drafted an urgent message to Hitler requesting permission to break out. He explained the tactical situation. The army had limited supplies, perhaps 2 weeks with strict rationing. Ammunition stocks were finite. Winter clothing was non-existent. The longer they waited, the weaker they would become, and the stronger Soviet forces would grow. Every day of delay meant more casualties and reduced chances of success. Hitler's response came swiftly and was catastrophic. The Sixth Army would not retreat. It would establish a hedgehog defense and hold until relieved. Fortress Stalingrad would tie down Soviet forces and prevent exploitation of the breakthrough. Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, personally guaranteed he could supply the pocket by air. The Reichsmarschall, desperate to restore his tattered reputation after failures in the Battle of Britain, promised to deliver 500 tons of supplies daily, the minimum calculated to sustain the trapped forces. It was a catastrophic fantasy. The Luftwaffe was already overstretched on multiple fronts. Transport aircraft, primarily obsolete Junkers U-53 trimotors, would have to fly through increasingly dangerous Soviet airspace in worsening weather. Airfields inside the pocket were primitive, and 500 tons per day was an almost impossible target, even under ideal conditions. But Hitler believed Göring's promises. Or perhaps he simply could not bring himself to order a retreat from a city bearing Stalin's name. General Paulus was trapped between loyalty and reality. A career staff officer who had never disobeyed an order, some of his subordinates urged him to ignore Berlin and break out on his own authority. General Walter von Seydlitz-Kutzbach, commanding LI Corps, even began withdrawing units without permission, hoping to force Paulus's hand. But Paulus countermanded the order. He said, "I am a German officer. I obey orders." It was a decision that sealed the fate of 290,000 men. The airlift began on November 25th. Junkers U-53s lumbered into the pocket carrying ammunition, food, and medical supplies. The first missions were moderately successful, delivering nearly 100 tons. But Soviet fighters, Yak-1s, Lag-3s, and American-made P-39 Airacobras began intercepting the transports. Anti-aircraft batteries ringed the pocket. Planes were shot down in flames, their crews incinerated or frozen in the wreckage. Others crashed in blizzards or were destroyed on the ground by artillery. Daily tonnage quickly fell below 100 tons, sometimes dropping to 50 or even 30. It was nowhere near enough. German soldiers bitterly joked about goring rations. The Reich Marshal had promised bread, but delivered nothing. Hunger became the constant companion. Rations were reduced again and again, from 300 grams of bread per day to 200, then 100, then 50. A slice, a mouthful, a memory. The horses were slaughtered first, thousands of them used to pull artillery and supply wagons. Horse meat became a treasured delicacy. Men boiled the bones for soup, chewed the hooves, ate every organ. When the horses were gone, they hunted dogs, cats, rats, crows, anything with meat. Leather belts were boiled into paste, boot soles were chewed. One soldier later described finding a frozen crow and feeling he discovered treasure.
Winter descended with savage cruelty. Temperatures plummeted to -30, then -40 degrees Celsius. German soldiers wore the same summer uniforms they'd marched in months earlier. Thin cotton trousers, light jackets, inadequate overcoats. Winter clothing existed in warehouses hundreds of miles away, but there was no room on aircraft to transport it. Ammunition took priority, then food, then medicine. Warm clothing was a luxury the dying army could not afford. Frostbite became epidemic. Men lost toes, fingers, ears, noses. Entire feet turned black with gangrene and had to be amputated. Field hospitals overflowed with frostbite cases. Surgeons operated without anesthesia. There was none left, cutting away dead tissue while patients screamed or bit down on leather straps to keep from shattering their teeth. Many died from shock or infection. Others simply gave up, lying down in the snow and waiting for the cold to claim them. Disease followed hunger. Typhus spread through cramped bunkers where soldiers huddled for warmth. Dysentery ravaged units. Men too weak to walk lay in their own filth. Medical supplies were exhausted. Bandages were washed and reused until they fell apart. Antiseptics were memories. Morphine was a dream. Wounded men suffered in silence or screamed until their voices gave out. The dead were stacked outside like cordwood, frozen solid, eyes open and staring at nothing. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, one of Germany's most brilliant commanders, assembled a relief force and launched Operation Winterstorm on December 12th. The 4th Panzer Army, reinforced with elite units, including the 6th Panzer Division, drove northeast through Soviet defenses. They covered 60 kilometers in a week. By December 19th, they were within 48 kilometers of the pocket, close enough to hear 6th Army's artillery, close enough to see fires on the horizon. Manstein sent urgent messages to Paulus: begin Operation Thunderclap, the breakout, attack south to link up. It was the last chance. If the Sixth Army moved now, most of the men could be saved. But Paulus hesitated. Hitler had not authorized a breakout. The Führer still demanded Stalingrad be held. Paulus drafted messages, pleaded for permission, argued desperately. Hitler's reply was unequivocal. Hold your positions. Relief is coming. The moment passed. Soviet reinforcements arrived and counterattacked, driving Manstein's panzers back. By December 23rd, the relief operation had failed. The Sixth Army was alone. Inside the pocket, hope died. The soldiers had believed rescue was coming. They had endured cold, hunger, and disease because they thought salvation was days away. Now they understood the truth. They had been abandoned. Christmas 1942 was the bleakest many could imagine. There were no rations, no special deliveries, no gifts from home. Some soldiers sang carols in weak voices before trailing into silence. Others wrote final letters, knowing they would never be mailed. "My dearest wife," one soldier wrote, "I do not think I will see home again. Tell our children I loved them more than life. Tell them their father died believing he served Germany, though I no longer know what Germany has become." By January 1943, the Sixth Army was disintegrating. Over 40,000 men had died from starvation, disease, cold, and Soviet attacks. The survivors were walking corpses, barely able to stand, their eyes sunken into skull-like faces. Discipline collapsed. Officers could not enforce orders. Men stayed in bunkers, too weak to move, waiting for death. On January 8th, Soviet officers approached German lines under white flags. They carried an ultimatum: surrender or be annihilated. The terms were surprisingly generous. Prisoners would receive food and medical care. Officers could keep personal belongings. All would be repatriated after the war. The alternative was clear: continue fighting and die. Paulus forwarded the ultimatum to Hitler, requesting permission to negotiate. Hitler's response was instant and absolute: surrender is forbidden. The Sixth Army will hold to the last man and last round. On January 10, 1943, Operation Ring began. 7,000 Soviet artillery pieces opened fire, pounding the pocket in a bombardment that shook the earth. Then came infantry and tanks, advancing methodically, crushing German positions sector by sector. The Sixth Army fought back hopelessly. Units at company strength tried to hold regimental sectors. Machine guns fell silent when ammunition ran out. Artillery fired final shells and was overrun. German soldiers surrendered in groups of dozens, then hundreds, then thousands. On January 26th, Soviet forces split the pocket in two, reaching the Volga. On January 30th, the 10th anniversary of Hitler's rise to power, the Führer promoted Paulus to Field Marshal in grotesque symbolism. No German field marshal had ever surrendered. The message was clear: Paulus was expected to commit suicide. On January 31, 1943, in a basement in Stalingrad, Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus surrendered. Soviet officers found him sitting at a table, gaunt and aged beyond his years. "I am Field Marshal Paulus. I surrender myself and my command." In the north, the last remnants fought on until February 2nd before capitulating. The Battle of Stalingrad was over. The Sixth Army had ceased to exist. Of 290,000 men encircled, approximately 91,000 were taken prisoner. Of those, fewer than 6,000 would ever return to Germany. The rest died in Soviet captivity from starvation, disease, and forced labor. total Axis casualties exceeded 850,000. Soviet casualties surpassed 1.1 million. Stalingrad was obliterated, reduced to rubble. Not a single building remained intact. But the strategic consequences eclipsed even these horrific losses. Stalingrad marked the true turning point of the war on the Eastern Front. The myth of Wehrmacht invincibility shattered forever. Germany would fight defensively from this moment, retreating slowly westward until Soviet tanks crashed through Berlin's gates in 1945. Private Anatoly Chekhov survived the battle. He fought through the war, was wounded twice more, and entered Berlin in May 1945. Years later, he returned to Stalingrad, renamed Volgograd, and stood at the railway station where his war had begun. "We were just boys," he said, tears in his eyes. "We became men in those ruins, and we died there, even those of us who survived." Stalingrad teaches us that wars are not won by ideology or will alone, but by the courage of soldiers and the terrible arithmetic of attrition. The frozen hell that consumed the Sixth Army changed world history, proving that even the mightiest armies can be broken when hubris meets determination. But while Stalingrad raged in the east, another pivotal battle was unfolding in North Africa, where Allied forces prepared to drive Rommel's Afrika Korps into the sea at El Alamein. Join us next time as we uncover the desert campaign that opened the door to Europe. Until then, remember those who fought, honor those who fell, and never forget that freedom's price is paid in blood and sacrifice.